Sounds good. It's funny. Okay, everyone. Good to see all of you here today. We're going to go ahead and get this program underway. I think all of you know my name is Will Inboden. I'm honored to be the Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security and a professor here at the LBJ School, your two hosts for today. And Dugald, where's Dugald? So, I think it's safe to say I'm an official friend of the Army Fellows Program, too. I've got that plaque up here. So anyway, many of you know that here at the UT, especially at the LBJ School, we've been honored to host classes of Army Fellows here at UT for the whole year for the last, how many years have been going to do this?
Since 92.
Since 1992, so anyway, before I was born. But we're also honored as part of our collaboration with Army War College in Carlisle to be able to host some visiting students from there who are going to be presenting the capstone of their research project for the year. Before I do those official introductions, because this is being taped and because we have an audience of distinguished people here, I know Rick, you needed to give some sort of disclaimer. So you guys are officially speaking for the U.S. government, right? And everything you say is okay.
That is absolutely incorrect.
Okay, that's great.
Thanks for the quick introduction. So first of all, on behalf of Major General Rapp, who is the Commandant of the U.S. Army War College, we'd like to express our utmost appreciation, first of all, to Professor Inboden, the Clements Center for National Security, the LBJ School for Public Affairs, and the University of Texas of hosting us for this great opportunity here today at lunchtime. First of all, if we could just clarify up front, we understand that this is going to be presented on YouTube, that the views expressed during this panel are our personal views. During this past year that we've had the opportunity in an academic setting, unlike what we will unlike the opportunities we'll have here in a couple months when we're working in official capacities. But again, the views that we express today are our personal views, not those of the Department of Defense, U.S. Army, or the Army War College.
Actually, great. All right, thank you. So we got that on record. So all my silly faculty joking notwithstanding. Anyway, so the animating theme for our discussion today is America and its armed forces, especially the relationship between us being a civilian society with the most lethal and effective military that the world has ever known, and yet particularly in the modern era of the all-volunteer force. The advantages that has given us in military effectiveness and combat effectiveness have also in some ways led to a deepening divide between civilian society and our active duty military. So as part of the research project or projects that these gentlemen have been engaged in, they've been looking at different dimensions of that, both internal processes within the military, but also different points of connection between the military and the broader society. And so we have three very distinguished and accomplished officers who are going to be speaking to us today on various aspects of their research. First up, we're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Mark Ray, a Special Forces officer, talking about recruitment and assessments. And then we're going to have Rick Balestri, who normally for his day job is a Middle East expert and a foreign area officer, but most recently in their embassy in Bahrain, talking about mid-career options. And then right next to me, Jerry Dunlop, a Judge Advocate General, who will be talking about modernization groups. So each of these guys will have about 5 to 10 minutes presenting his particular slice of the research. Then I'll put a few questions to them, and then we'll turn it over to an interactive question with all of you. So, and actually, I neglected to do something at the beginning. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome from officers. All the way out here from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Come see us. So, all right. So, Mark, we'll start with you. Oh, we're starting with Rick. Oh, okay. Sorry, I had the order wrong. All right. So,
I'm just going to start with a quick background on the U.S. Army War College in our seminar that we're part of. For those of you that may not have any experience with the what's called the Department of Defense Senior Service Colleges. So approximately just under 400 students attend the resident program at the U.S. Army War College. It's comprised of about 70 international fellows, ranging the gamut from literally every region in the world. In our specific seminar, we have international fellows from Colombia, India, and Jamaica. And there's a representation from Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and everywhere in between. There's also representatives from all of the different services in the United States Department of Defense, and there's also representatives from the civilian side of our interagency, Department of State, Department of the Army, civilians, and so on. The program is approximately 10 months. We cover a core curriculum and then also electives, and our specific seminar is comprised of 17 students. As I described, the 3 international fellows that we have, and then we have representation from the Army National Guard, Army Reserve, and then the bulk of our class is active duty Army, and the 3 of us, Mark, Jerry, and myself, are just kind of, it's a little bit of a mixture from different backgrounds within our class. So the last several months, our seminar has been working on a project focused on defense reform. We split ourselves into 5 different groups, and the 4 areas that we looked at. We have 2 groups that are looking at structural reform. Some of you are familiar with the geographic combatant commands and the functional combatant commands. Those groups are looking at potentially other ways in the future that might be more efficient ways to organize the Department of Defense and its headquarters. We have another group that's looking at readiness, and what does it mean for the U.S. Army to be ready, Department of Defense, and what are some options there. Jerry is a member of the modernization group, and he will talk after Mark and I on some of the initiatives that they recommend from the modernization group. And then lastly, from the personnel group, Mark, myself, and we have 2 other members of our class who are back in Pennsylvania today. And we essentially looked at, from kind of a fresh perspective, the entire continuum of the Army personnel system from prior to recruiting until either leaving the service or retiring, and everything in between. So our comments, Mark and my comments, will be focused on U.S. Army. They are somewhat applicable to the other services. Many of the services face some of the same challenges that we do in the Army with recruiting, accessions, mid-career opportunities, and then retirement or end-of-career opportunities. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mark to start us off.
Thanks, Rick. As Rick had said, our overall project was looking at defense reform, but especially with personnel, we looked at it through the optic of the Army, not just because we're Army officers, but as the primary provider for strategic manpower based off of numbers alone. We've got some unique responsibilities and requirements as an Army to provide trained and ready forces to the joint force to achieve the nation's strategic goals. So the 2 areas that I'm going to discuss here are recruiting, our current methods and ways that we believe we can improve a little bit of current but more future recruiting. We have a great all-volunteer force throughout the entire DoD, but we know we still have some gaps that will continue to grow in time, and I'll talk about that. The other area that that I'll discuss are our entry standards and our assessments. We've got some batteries of tests that have been in place for decades, which do a good job in some areas of quantifying what we're looking for candidates for Army service and really DoD service, but we know that there, again, are some gaps that we can not only refine some of those assessments and those tests, but we might even be able to introduce that type of testing earlier into possibly the public school system. So we can that kind of in turn helps inform our recruiting strategies into the future. So what we do want to make sure that we emphasize, we have 4 decades, roughly 4 decades of the all-volunteer force, which I think across the board we recognize that it's as we no longer are looking at a model of mass conscription in times of war, but rather looking at a smaller, more professional, sustained force over time that while when we go into a new era of conflict, we always have some lessons learned, but we've got some baselines that have been established, not just within our leadership, but even our younger soldiers, that we can react a little bit faster that doesn't require a million new soldiers, which we know that's not a reality that we'll be able to go back to, or nor should we. So taking the strengths of the all-volunteer force and trying to look at what we have currently and looking at the landscape, a couple of the challenges that we have right now. We have geographic underrepresentation throughout the DoD and especially in the Army as well. And in Texas, one of the DoD service friendliest states, not just our reception today. We've talked, none of us are from Texas, but we you know, on the whole trip, we can recount how many people from the day we came into service, how we've known Texans, and there's been a large number. So I'm from Virginia originally, from Northern Virginia, so there's a little bit of the DC, but throughout the South and Southeast, there's a pretty, I would say, almost an over-representation within DoD. The good news is, I mean, there's a balance. We have a good lineage. There's a lot of family tradition in military service. I didn't come from a military family, other than my brother, but the downside of that is over time, that means we have a large portion of the United States where families don't have a connection to the Army. And obviously we're biased. It's a good profession. There's some great opportunities to serve in the Army, you know, just like there's other professions which you can serve. But the more that we become a family business, that means as the nation grows, that's a much larger portion that doesn't have contact with the Army, and therefore, you know, might not understand some of the changes, and that, you know, whether it's a conflict or national security strategy or resourcing and budgeting decisions, if a portion of the nation, and that's really where we are right now, the Northeast U.S. is a good example, it's highly underrepresented, that can really impact how not just they feel about the military, not that they're anti-military, but if you don't have that personal connection, that can not only change your view of it, but if you look at Congress, incoming congressmen are elected over and over again and have a high success rate, and if a geographic region doesn't have a connection with the military, that might, over time, impact how that the congressional bodies in that area, you know, may or may not have different views on the way that DoD needs to go. So, like we said, the family density, family member density, it's a good tradition, but we also need to keep an eye on that to make sure that we are reaching out through our recruiting to the rest of the United States. And a lot of that has to do with exposure, and that's in different ways. You know, there's ROTC programs such as here, where it's a good exposure for whether it's through scholarship or other means where students can learn about the Army, see if they want to serve in it, and you know, ultimately, your chancellor's a great example that, you know, goes through the system and then and it goes on for years of service. But in schools that don't have ROTC programs, we do think that there are some options to maybe do, like the Marine Corps has a split summer option where you can spend a little bit of time in a basic training type environment for a summer, maybe try that for a couple summers, and then your numbers might not be large, but it's going to increase the exposure, much like a junior ROTC program that you would have in the public schools. Another area, we talk about base realignment and closure, BRAC. The more that we close down bases throughout the U.S., you know, as we see now, a lot of the service members that we have are from families that are around current bases. The more we close bases in underrepresented areas, it takes away even more of that exposure. We're not saying not to BRAC certain, I mean, obviously there's more to it, but we need to understand that when we close bases, especially if there's not a large representation within DoD, that might have an exposure effect, that people don't have contact with the military. To see that as a post-high school vocational opportunity for them to do. It doesn't have to be a lifetime of service. It'd be great if it isn't, or it'd be great if it is, but they won't necessarily know that that's out there. So when we look at the recruiting side, that will go transitions to who we bring into the service. If we have a larger pool of applicants that we're looking at, even if it's an all-volunteer force, then that's better than looking at the smaller group, which kind of where we currently are. So when we look at standards, we're going to group it into cognitive, physical, and social or non-cognitive areas. On the cognitive side, we currently have the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. It's been in existence since the 70s, the ASVAB. But the ASVAB is taken by those that show up to the recruiting station for the most part, and are already they're already contemplating service. So we look at research as a good battery to see if a recruit is going to successfully complete their initial training, along with a high school diploma. That's another metric that is a good indicator that they will be able to see through their initial training and their initial term of service. But as we look at many areas of research, we think we can expand the testing. We can expand cognitive testing. So not only are you seeing if a recruit, hey, they could complete their initial training, but also, hey, can we look at job suitability so that we put them into a specialty in the Army? It's not just because their dad was an infantryman or their mom was an aviator, that they want to go into that field, but maybe they've got certain, whether it's personality traits or intellectual capacity, say, hey, you might be a better fit here. Or if they choose to go that other route because they really want to go into that specialty or there's a need there, just know you may struggle in those areas. So that's more on the cognitive testing. And the physical testing, if you've seen if you've had any family members, we have the Army Physical Fitness Test, which has been in existence for decades, and it has not changed very much. And every several years, you can see in the press that there's going to be a new Army Physical Fitness Test, and at least in 20 plus years, it hasn't changed yet. There's actually a pretty good change in motion for entry-level physical testing called the Operational Physical Assessments Test, the OPAT, and it looks at, they did research through Natick Labs for several years to look at task-specific requirements for military jobs, especially in combat arms specialties. So that when they did a task like loading a howitzer round into a gun, which muscles were used and how do you actually test that? 2 minutes of push-ups, 2 minutes of sit-ups, and a 2-mile run, which we currently do, are not necessarily the best test for that. So initial testing, they have improved in the use of the OPAT. They started that in January for basic trainees, so that's going in the right direction. What we're proposing here is, let's take a look at that for our assessment. Let's refine our assessment so that the tests that we are giving our, not only our soldiers, but future recruits, let's make it so we're testing skills that are going to be applicable to the task that they will do as soldiers. And then the reason we talk about that is not only can we do better assessments for recruits, but we've got systems already in place in the public school system. We've got standardized testing in every school, whether it's in many of the academic areas. We still have the Presidential Youth Fitness Program, which has been in existence through the 50s. And actually some of the events that the FitnessGram is the current test there, they actually have some pretty good tests that are similar to some of our OPAT events. What we're proposing is, if we look at if DoD and Department of Education can look at maybe some joint endeavor to say, hey, let's shape those testing so the tests so that if I'm a recruiter in a recruiting station, I've got the ability to look at this public school system. Here's their FitnessGram track record, and maybe they have a good physical education program where their students are doing pretty well. That might shape some of our recruiting efforts and where we need to learn. So those are kind of the broad areas that we look at for some of our recruitment and assessment and accession recommendations. And then as Rick talked about, I'll pass it over to him as we take it. That's kind of the entry into service in the beginning. And then we've got some areas to look at for our mid and end of career management within the Army specifically that we think we've got some areas to improve.
Thanks, Mark. So the area that I specifically looked at is around the mid-career military career options. And most people would say, mid-career, that's not a decision point. You know, after you get over the hump of 10 years, you're staying in, right? Well, things are going to change, or potentially change. On January 1st of 2018, so here in a little bit more than half a year, the blended retirement system takes effect for everybody that all newly enlisted soldiers and newly entered officers. Personnel within the Department of Defense are able to also switch into the blended retirement system. So the blended retirement system is different from the current retirement system, which is strictly based on if you serve 20 years, you receive 50% of your base pay, and then every year thereafter you get an additional 2.5%. If you leave the service at 19 years, you leave with nothing. In most cases, there are some very limited early retirement options. So the blended retirement system is a hybrid system which has a pension which has a annual multiplier of 2%. So essentially if you serve 20 years, you will receive 40%, and then each year thereafter an additional 2%. But it also has a matching 401k called the Thrift Savings Plan that the Department of Defense pays in 5%. You can max it out, max out the matching up to 5%. So I looked at this and said, I think there's a chance that this may change what we call the stay in, get out calculus of somebody potentially at 6, 8, 10, 12 years, when you're looking at, potentially a service member is about 30 years old, potentially getting married, potentially having children, potentially looking at other job options, and saying, okay, there's a chance that, or under the blended retirement system, I will receive a smaller pension at 20 years, and I have the potential to take this 401k that I've been paying into, and the Army or the Navy or whomever has been also paying into with me right now. So looking at this, I perceive that the blended retirement system provides both opportunities with some of the recommendations that I'll talk about here in a second. It also presents retention challenges that the Army specifically and some of the other armed services may encounter here in the next couple of years. So the blended retirement system has a provision for the services to provide what's called continuation pay. In layman's terms, that's a retention bonus. The services do this right now. The Air Force right now, you've probably read about some of the retention challenges that they're having with pilots due to the shortages in airline pilots right now. So essentially, the services can decide if they have a shortage in special forces or aviators or a specific niche capability, that they can provide a retention bonus. Under the blended retirement system, that opportunity also exists to help incentivize continued service at the, let's say 8, 10, 12-year point. What happens if that doesn't work? What are some other options? So the three options that I focus on are as follows. So the first one is probably a little bit contentious, and some folks that served in the military may have some comments, so I welcome those after we finish here. But the first one would be direct appointment or lateral entry of civilians, well-qualified, well-educated civilians that have experience in a similar field for non-combat related jobs. So the way that this would look would be potentially a civilian who has significant experience in the IT field, has an advanced degree in perhaps computer engineering, IT, has worked in the sector for 10, 12 years, would be able to enter the service for a limited duration, maximum of 3 years, fill a critical billet, say in Army Cyber Command, for those years, and then we could bring them on at a pay rate that's commensurate with their education and experience, and then they would be able to pay into the blended retirement system and take out that 401k that they had paid into. They would also have the option of continuing service in the reserve component, but they would not be able to compete for like key billets such as command billets or something like that in the active duty. As Mark talked earlier, we have the U.S. military and the Army is encountering challenges right now with geographic representation and diversity, if you will. So this could help address, if you've got folks, perhaps from the Northeast or from some of the underrepresented areas, that, as a 35-year-old who's been working in the IT industry or in public affairs or in logistics for 15 years, your incentive to join the military as a private or as a second lieutenant at that age is very low. But if you're able to come in for a limited duration, make pay that's commensurate with your education experience, may be an attractive option. So that's kind of the first recommendation. The second recommendation is increase the flexibility to activate reserve component officers, again, who have unique education or professional experience in the civilian life, to come in and fill critical active duty billets that may be unfilled due to retention challenges with the blended retirement system. Here in Austin, we've got a great example with the Defense Innovation Unit experimental, that they have reservists who are highly educated, highly trained, have very applicable civilian jobs, and they can drill or do their reserve component time. What if we were to open up the options to allow them to come on to active duty for a couple years, again, limited duration, potentially up to about 3 years, and serve in that capacity. The last one that I'll talk about is reappointment of officers. So what this means is essentially you've got an officer who serves in their branch that they're commissioned in for 5, 6 years, pays back their initial commitment, decides that continued service is not for them. They go out and get an advanced degree, perhaps they work in the private sector for a while, and then they realize that they would actually prefer to return back to active duty service. There is a precedent for this. It's very, very small right now, but the Army is also, and all the services have started a sabbatical program right now, which is referred to in the Army as a career intermission program. The demand for that program has been relatively low. And I think the decision that somebody could make, or the perception that you could look at is, if somebody's looking at leaving the military, they probably want to do it with a clean break, not having a service requirement on the end of that sabbatical. So my suggestion here is, with the reappointment, somebody that's gotten out, has been out for several years and wants to come back in, potentially increasing the service's flexibility to bring that person back onto active duty. The benefits there is you've got somebody who's got some private sector experience, potentially some additional education, and they've got some, typically with those folks that have left and then want to come back, they really want to be there at that point. The last couple areas that I'll talk about is at the end of service. Again, if we have retention issues and there are key capabilities or skills that are leaving the military, potentially related to the blended retirement system, I recommend that we should have more flexibility in the end of service. So what this means is, right now, the military has a maximum time in service and maximum age requirements for individuals. So perhaps there could be waivers that could be issued for 1 year at a time for key individuals. An example would be if you've got somebody who's specially trained in a language and you literally do not have anybody else in the service that can fill that billet, perhaps you could extend that person for 1 more year. Perhaps we could look at recalling retirees, again, for a very short period. This would all be, we understand that we're in a resource-constrained environment, and that you obviously can't continually add and add and add people. This would be balanced with what we refer to as the selective early retirement boards, of finding folks that perhaps are at their retirement point, and it's better for them and for the service for them to leave the service. And that opens up an opportunity for a few of the people that have been asked to stay on because they're critical skills for an additional year. So that is my 3 suggestions to perhaps address some of the retention challenges that may result from the implementation of the retirement system. So at this point, we're going to switch gears from personnel focus over to Jerry, who's in the modernization group, and he'll be the last one to present here, and then we'll open it up to Professor Inboden's questions, and then your questions.
Okay, so thank you for coming. We really appreciate your attendance. There's really, for defense reform, there's really 3 areas where you can put your resources. Personnel, which we've talked about. Readiness, how is the force ready right now to go into the fight? And then finally, modernization. And as you put resources in one of those, there's kind of a cost benefit and an impact as you're doing a little bit of a shell game. So a focus on readiness now may have a negative impact on modernization in the future, and vice versa. So as we're looking at modernization right now, the term that we like to use to our modernization is called the third offset. Now, the third offset is a reference to the first 2 offsets, which turn back to the Cold War. So in the 1950s, the Soviets had a significant conventional forces overmatch compared to us. And so President Eisenhower, under the first offset, it was called New Look, they decided that they could downsize the size of the military, the number of personnel. We could take some risk there because of the significant advantage that we had in our nuclear arsenal. So less risk because they had that significant overmatch because of the nuclear arsenal. By the 70s, we felt that overmatch had gone away. The first offset was no longer effective because they were pretty much at parity with us on the nuclear side as well. And so that's when the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, they began a project that was called Assault Breaker. And that was developing technology, precision guided munitions, deep strike capabilities, stealth, other capabilities that would allow us to attack those large advantage in conventional forces that the Soviets had. And that was, again, exceptionally, that was a game changer and mitigated that risk of the advantage that they had in conventional forces. And we saw that come to bear in the Persian Gulf War, where those capabilities were able to really overwhelm the Iraqi forces there.
Pardon my rude interruption, I just can't miss an opportunity to advertise here. Of course, that second offset was under a lot of the oversight and leadership of Bill Clements, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time. So anyway, end of advertisement, back to presentation. So got your namesake right here.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. So those were two major defense initiatives, modernization efforts, that for over 5 decades provided clarity and great advantage to as far as defense modernization. And our strategy was really based off of that. We've now got to the point where we've lost, perhaps to some degree, that same advantage that we had. And so we're now looking at the third offset. And we're trying to define exactly what that is and the type of technologies that we should invest in for that. The advantage of the first and second offset, you had a very rigid technology, you had a rigid enemy, clearly defined enemy that you were going against, and so we had a temporal, a time aspect that we could take advantage of with identifying that risk and how we're going to offset that. We lack that in our current environment. We don't have a clearly defined enemy that we're focused on. With non-state actors, with many different players in the world stage, it's very difficult to define where that should be focused. And so that's one of the difficulties that we have. And then also technology is changing so dramatically and so quickly. It's very volatile. So again, very difficult. Don't have that same rigid advantage that we had there. So our proposal as far as the offset, the risk that we should offset here, is that we should focus our modernization efforts and investments, investing on technology and tactics that mitigate the time it takes for us to effectively respond to a risk. So this should be a temporal or response time type investment in technology. So we should develop capabilities that will allow us to respond quicker when we meet those risks. And there's really two types of risks that we address. First, we don't have the same number of forward deployed formations that we had in the past during the Cold War. And so it's going to take time for us to respond and to mobilize our forces and to move them forward. As where in the past, during the Cold War, we had a lot more forward deployed forces. And so that's the first area where we need to develop technologies that is going to mitigate that risk, either slowing down an adversary, their ability to move against our allies or our forward deployed forces, or speed up the time that it takes, our ability to quickly respond to that. So that's that first temporal risk that we face. And then the second temporal risk is as a technology gap. Are there technologies that we are going to encounter in the future that we don't have a response to? And we need to be able to speed up our ability to develop those technologies quickly and respond to those. And just a couple of ways that we can look at that. So the Tesla CEO, Elon Musk, he talks a lot about the machines that build machines or factories out there. He feels that that is where a lot of production advantages can happen there. And so he is looking at miniaturization of factories, building smaller, more efficient factories. The advantage that would build for us is if we could have factories that could be forward deployed and mobile, so you can bring them closer to the front, that allows you to more quickly respond to a risk forward. Also, additive manufacturing like 3D printing, we've seen great breakthroughs in that recently. If you had additive manufacturing that could be deployed forward, then you could build spare parts, munitions, weapons, all of that without having the incredibly long and expensive logistics trail. You could put that forward, and that would again reduce that risk that we have. So those are the types of investments that we think the third offset should be focusing on. What can you do to mitigate that time risk and our ability to respond to it more quickly? There's great technologies out there, but if we focus on that, we can really have an effective offset that is focusing on a risk that we can overcome.
All right. Let me first want to make an observation and then a question that will cut across all three of your presentation. Your first observation is for everyone in the room. One thing that I find so refreshing about the presence of these gentlemen here in this panel is our military does such a good job compared to a number of other elements of our national security system, the intelligence community, sorry Paul, the Foreign Service, add professional development and sort of mid-career education. The fact that we have this institutionalized system here with our PME units, these guys to study this for a year and then do, provide some internal self-criticism of the system they're a part of. So I think that should not go without comment, and it's something I think a number of the other civilian elements of the national security interagency system would be wise to adopt. So my question, this is a thematic question for all three of you, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on in your particular area. The role of Congress in some of these reforms you're calling for. If you listen to our last several secretaries of defense and the current one, if we gave him some truth serum, Congress is almost always an impediment to reform, whether it's some of these parochial interest or just lack of awareness about the military. And so we may have some great ideas for reform of different elements of the military, but Congress is usually going to be the obstacle. But at the same time, looking historically, Congress has it's sometimes been the leading edge of reform. I mean, Goldwater Nichols, of course, would be the exemplar of this, where it was the military that was resistant to that, and yet, some visionaries in Congress, especially Senator Nunn and Senator Goldwater. So, as you look at the different ideas you've presented here, what would be the role of Congress, feasibly, I guess, in this current environment, in encouraging these, whether through oversight or new legislation or new authorities or what have you? So, and again, this is just your personal opinion. So, any members of Congress watching this thing here, this is not the Army speaking. These are just some concerned citizens.
Well, I'll start off with that.
Sure.
I think one of the changes over time with our current, if we just take an all-volunteer force that we have recognized that is basically a standing army, is somewhat of a departure from the original intent. In the Constitution, our government is to raise a Navy, or to sustain a Navy and to raise and support armies. Our model now, which I believe is the right model, is that we have a standing army. We've tailored it down, we think, to a sustainable amount, and then it's Congress's responsibility and oversight to provide that budget. I would kind of turn it around that on our side, this has been a good year for us to learn is we as Army officers need to ensure that we're able to communicate clearly to Congress of what our needs are. Congress does a tremendous job of answering to its constituents, and that's what it is designed for. We've got to make sure that we're able to understand as Army leadership, and I say that not as capital letters Army leadership. All of us need to be able to communicate effectively. Hey, these are the requirements that we need to fill as an Army. These are the whether it's funding needs, program needs, or authorities. I think that's where we've got to be able to articulate that in a concise manner. And obviously, we've got some tremendous experience throughout the audience in different interagency areas, some within DoD, some within other agencies of the government before, and probably have different experiences within the Army. That's one challenge that we definitely have, but I think part of it is the size of the Army is we've got to make sure we've got a consistent message that comes from the Army, whether that's to Congress or to our partners. And I think to make sure that we have a clear message to Congress, I think that is the first part of this on how we can ensure that what they are responsible for oversight is answering or is providing what we need to accomplish our mission.
So from the mid-career and end-of-career perspective, from my perspective, and we've spoken with several experts in the personnel field from down in Washington, several trips, and the precedent exists for all three of the recommendations that I laid forth: the direct appointment of civilians, the activation of reserve component officers, and the appointment of current officers. All of that has been used to varying degrees, here in the last 15 years or so. I think the bigger question to ask is whether or not the National Defense Authorization Act and the appropriation that follows that would provide the services the required amount of money to pay the continuation pay if there is a retention challenge. Right now, if you look at the challenge that the U.S. Air Force is facing, there's potential for a 13-year, a retention bonus that lasts 13 years that goes upwards of $450,000 to keep certain pilots in. That's an enormous amount of money. So that's for potentially a shortage of 1,500 pilots. Let's say the blended retirement system, worst case scenario, there's a huge departure of Army officers to the scale of 5,000, 10,000 that they're not able to provide an incentive. What does that cost to the American taxpayer to keep them in? So if they can't, then potentially some of these recommendations that we talked about, which there's U.S. code that allows the services to direct appoint officers up to the grade of colonel. Potentially some of these options that we talked about may be on the table.
Jerry, before you answer this one, I want to observe for the record, and this is Professor Inboden speaking, not speaking for these others, but as a matter of history, it is interesting to note that whereas the first two offsets were very much the result of the strategic environment, particularly Soviet advances, the third offset in some ways is caused by Congress, this kind of boneheaded sequester. So it's something we've done to ourselves. I wish I could say it was Red China that had caused the third offset, but it's our friends on Capitol Hill. So. Well,
yeah. and unpredictability of budgets can be a complicating factor to the modernization process. That's definitely true. The military also, we create our own problems oftentimes. When we move forward with giant modernization projects that take years to develop, you have problems with requirement creep, where we add on more and more to a project, which makes it more and more expensive and harder for Congress then to write the check for that in the end. The example that I like to look at, the P-51 Mustang in World War II was developed in 117 days from the time that there was an agreement that they were going to produce it to the time the first was produced. An incredibly short time where there was a need that was put forward. Actually, the Navy said, we want you to build this aircraft, and industry came back and said, actually, we think we can build this one better. And so they were able to do that in a quick amount of time. And I think quite often that could be the model for us, to try and be much quicker. That will keep the size of the whole project down in a little more bite-sized, chewable projects, and also avoid some of that long-term requirement creep that is expensive, and then also allows Congress maybe to become more involved and more tempted to see how that is going to impact their district. The F-35 has subcontractors in almost every state in the country.
It takes 117 days to do a new washer for the bolt for the F-35.
So, Will, there were no lawyers involved in the P-51 project.
Yeah, that's true. So, hey, careful, we got a lawyer here. That's right. I see one over there too. Okay, so, yeah. All right, I've got a lot more questions, but I think our audience is going to have better ones. So would love to hear any questions from the audience. So they're here.
My name is Ernest Auerbach. I'm a retired 06, served in Germany, Vietnam, and the Pentagon. And one of the themes which you gentlemen have discussed is the underrepresentation, both in the service and in Congress, not understanding our problems. The reason fundamentally is because we don't have a draft. I believe in the draft. Now, I know that when we have draftees, they cause a lot of problems. Training, sometimes military offenses. But we get some other things from draftees. First of all, it's the way the country was designed to have its military. When every mother's son, potentially, and maybe daughters these days, spends time in the military, there are certain things you get. You get a broader representation in the underrepresented areas. You get skilled reservists who have been on active service, unlike a lot of the Reserve and National Guard components. And believe it or not, you get some really good men and women that I've served with who decide to stay in the military. Brighter people than, with respect, a lot of the volunteers. I would say some of the volunteers come into the service, and I have a high regard for them, but it's because they're challenged to find good jobs on the civilian side. If you have more draftees, you have a very different style. And I know, just one more episode. After My Lai, I was in the Pentagon, and I was given the assignment to analyze all of the other cases like My Lai. There were 300. And I did that. And most of the people who blew the whistle on junior officers and senior non-commissioned officers who were engaged in improper activities were draftees, because they were less inclined just to say, yes, sir. They had a different point of view. So that's all.
First, sir, thanks for your service. You were in service through many pivotal times for our nation. Obviously, I'm not in the know. I'm not sure we're looking at reinstating the draft, but a few things that I wanted to kind of note that I think are good approaches for us to try to grasp what was good about the draft and where it is now. So I think that's where, starting in the 70s and that importance of the Reserve and National Guard service, I think allows us to increase that reach to America to communities and families that don't necessarily have active duty service members. That's one thing that I will say. Many different reputations, maybe deserved, maybe not, of Guard and Reserves in the past. I can tell you over the last couple of decades, especially within service in combat theaters, that Guard from Texas is definitely one. Guard and Reserve units have performed unbelievably well. I mean, that's a poor term. Did a tremendous job, and we all had a steep learning curve in many ways in both theaters, as we do in any conflict. So I think that is one method. Another one I think is just discussions like this today. And we talk about I talked about one portion of the civilian military gap that we have, and recruiting is one method to approach that. But even if we look at interagency cooperation, if we look at specifically with the State Department, USAID, little ways with the Bureau, or even Congress is a good example, not necessarily congressmen and women, but the professional staff members, we recognize we need to have a better connection with America and with our interagency partners. But because of the size of DoD, we've got a professional structure and a timeline. What we don't have in our early years in the Army, especially as officers, I didn't necessarily work with a new State Department Foreign Service officer my first few years in the Army. It wasn't until I was probably a captain in combat where I started running into my peers in the other agencies. I think that's a gap that I don't know if the structure is going to change, but that's where it's important, especially in university exchanges here. You can establish those relationships before you spread off into different parts of the world. It may be 10 years before, like Rick working in an embassy or working in DC, working in the Pentagon, that you can come back and say, yeah, I've got a pretty good network of friendships that I had in college, and we went into the intel community, we went into policy areas of the government to have that relationship to go back to. And the last thing I will say is I've got nothing to compare it to except for the last 20 years. And I've spent I spent most of my time in Fort Bragg, but I spent the last couple of years at West Point, and I'll go back there after this year. The one thing I'll say about the kids that have come into the Army, excuse me, it's kind of, I get a little choked up, but this is the 9/11 generation. The cadets that are graduating from West Point were probably in first or second grade when 9/11 happened. They grew up, they grew up watching two wars fought on TV, not very popular many times. And the soldiers, sailors, and airmen made the same choice. Said, hey, I watched this as a kid. It's not necessarily a popular thing to do, but they made that choice to say, hey, I see this as a noble act of service. So I can definitely tell you, I can only speak the ones I've known, but I think it's across the board. We've got a great group of volunteers, and I hope we can continue that discussion to kind of look back into our history in many different areas. Hey, what was good about having a larger representation in America? But I will say that we've got a great group of men and women that are deciding to go into the service. Sometimes that's not the most popular choice to make, but that's part of our job too, is to say, hey, it's a good opportunity to serve, even if it's for 4 years or for a lifetime. But hopefully we can carry on a good tradition of what you did during the difficult years too.
Thank you. Ernest, if I could just provide one bit of context. So for the last decade or so, I've been working with our Middle Eastern partners. And in a couple instances, I've worked somewhat in close proximity to militaries that have recently transitioned, here in the last couple of years, from a conscription style to a all-volunteer. And from the feedback that I've received from them, again, I've got to take this anecdotally because, like Mark, obviously I wasn't in the service at the Vietnam or World War II. Those countries see it as a positive step. The challenges that they ran into was from a resource perspective, that you had to spread your resources so far across because you had so many recruits coming in, and some of the stories that you would hear about, folks just not wanting to be there. There are places, there are outliers. I would say that universal conscription works exceptionally well. Israel is a shining example. Universal conscription and kind of the national service that they inculcate their youth with is second to none. Nobody else does it as well as them. There are also examples throughout the world that it does not work very well. And it becomes, there are places where the military becomes a jobs program. And that does not help you focus resources, training, manpower for the most effective force. So it's not a black and white answer.
Indeed.
Okay, Len.
I don't want to extend this conversation on one subject, but I do want to support the Colonel's comments. As Jerry and I joked earlier, I went in the Army the year he was born. And so the draft was very much alive in those days. Like most things, it's not everything is great or everything is bad. I think there are some lessons to be learned, and maybe something that ties into the niches that you were talking about. One of the good things, I came from a small town. In the town hall was a typed framed list of all the kids who had died from our hometown, so everybody felt like they had skin in the game. It certainly would fix what Mark was talking about there were no places where there were no people in service. But to the comment about the niches, we drafted specialties like doctors. There are a lot of MDs who went in because the law at that time had a special program for drafting doctors. So the fact that we won't go back to a general draft does not necessarily mean zero draft. You might have a fourth spot, Richard, for drafting specialties. Anyway, I support everything you said. It's consistent with my experience back in those days.
Somehow I don't know if they'll get around to drafting professors, but so, all right, okay. Hey, any of our active duty students here, John, Brian, you guys, so, Brian, go ahead. All right.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, I thought that was a hand. All right, so, all right, okay, yes, right here.
I'm curious in terms of modernization, if you're looking at anything in terms of reducing sort of the overhead of using technology to change the tooth-to-tail ratio as a way to get more bang for the buck.
Right, that is definitely one of the areas. I didn't focus on that, but some of the students that worked with me did focus on kind of a cultural reform of how we can change modernization and our approach to that to try and make it more efficient. Part of which could be waiting until the technology is ready, as opposed to entering into a project that we think 5 years from now we'll be able to develop the technology for that. The costs there tend to be exceptionally high and really drive that up. And so there are definitely efforts that are being made to try and get that under control, to lower those expenses for that. And to do that reform. Now, reform of this is very difficult. We were talking before that many secretaries of defense recently have come in trying to reform that, and it's hard to do. I mean, there's different factors that impact that. Congress being one of them, right? They have a stake in the game, and rightly so. The military the defense military industry out there, some of the major players there, they have a heavy stake in this game, and they are powerful players, and that may make it difficult to reform. And then the procedures that we have in place for contracting, for acquisition, have been developed from lessons learned over the years. Well, this went wrong, and so we're going to put these rules in. And this went wrong, and we're going to put these rules in. And it's like a scab growing over the years, and no one's ever really peeled that back. And so it is so burdensome with so many rules out there that it is very difficult to do. And that's why DUIX and others are trying to get around that with special authorities to speed up the process to make it more efficient.
I will say that I know Chairman McCain of the SASC and Chairman Thornberry, UTLM Haskell, both made procurement and acquisition reform a major priority of their time there, but getting that through all the special interests is going to be a real challenge. So, was there a question here? Yes.
Yes, sir. Colonel Reddy, quick question. You talked briefly about communicating what our needs are to Congress and the civ-mil gap. Do you think part of the problem could be that we don't really know what our needs are because their priorities are endless? You look at what we have to prepare for, from full spectrum operations, stability operations, to proceeding in Liberia to prevent a health crisis. So do you think that plays into our issues in the Department of the Army, specifically for what we have to prepare for and how we communicate our needs?
That's a good question. I don't know if I would qualify it as priorities or endless, but I think I can look at my own experience at times where you've got an opportunity to engage, especially professional staff members. I'm probably looking at it from a tactical to maybe operational level. I'm looking at specific equipment that we need to accomplish that mission. Either we're doing it right then, or I've got it on the horizon in the next month, and that's the perspective that I'm giving. Whereas that professional staff member, they may have been looking at the acquisition of a certain type of equipment or a certain type of capability for a number of years, and they've got maybe a more holistic understanding of what goes into that. If I say, hey, I need this type of electronic capability to speak to somebody around a corner, I may not see the 10-year program issues that are associated with it. So I think what I would say in the communicating our needs is, we've got to, especially as tactical leaders, we've got to understand what our tactical job is, but we've got to make sure that we are also at the right time in the right place, understand, okay, I've got to communicate effectively. If I'm talking to whether it's a congressman coming to visit or one of their staff members who can be a very good advocate for what we need, I've got to be able to articulate that effectively. And that's one thing in our training pipeline. We do work on communicating, from the time we come into the Army. I think sometimes notice we don't have any PowerPoint today, by the way.
I was shocked when they said that.
Trying to make sure that we do it effectively in a manner that it's not just going to be received the right way, but we are able to speak to whatever audience in a right way that it will be received effectively. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. I guess what more I'm getting at is, should we expect more of a prioritization from our senior civilian leaders on what we should have, what we should be ready for in the future, predictability in our missions that we're going to be assigned, to allow us to prioritize what our needs are going to be?
Maybe, but the reality is we're never going to guess.
Yeah.
We're never going to be I think we're 100% consistent that we get it wrong. And I think that's just a reality of real life. What I do believe, and whether it's our civilian leaders or at each echelon of military leaders all the way to each one of us, is we take the priorities that are on our plate. We say, okay, if I've got 10, I've got to actually figure out, we say this in all the leadership classes, I've got to put those in the right order. And I've got to be honest with not just my own organization, but maybe my leaders. Hey, I'm not going to be able to get 9 and 10 done today. And as leaders, we've got to establish that culture where our subordinates are able to come to us and say, hey, I can't get 2 to 10 done today. And we figure out, okay, is there something that I as a leader can I change? Hey, no, we got to get 2 and 3 done. I think that's part of the leadership dilemma that's probably existed since the Garden of Eden. That, hey, we're going to have a lot on our plate. We can't eat it all, so what's the most important thing that we've got to do And how do we set up our organization for success? Is that any better?
Yes.
Shot two.
Okay, all right, John?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. You guys talked about,
And can you identify yourself?
yes, sir, I'm John Magri. I'm an African Foreign Area Officer, student at the LBJ School. You guys talked about the lateral direct commissioning program, but wouldn't it be more effective to perhaps do more interagency exchanges between, not only the interagency domains, but between the public and private sector? We talked about Tesla. Why not send a mid-career officer who has a background in electrical engineering to Tesla for a year, and then perhaps send one of their engineers to the Pentagon to ensure that we're focusing on the right type of capabilities that we need in order to address the right problems, specifically in the technology domain.
John, that's a great setup. I appreciate the underhand softball for me. If you read the whole paper, which I knew you probably didn't have access to, so one of the things that the U.S. Army has, and I believe other services have, is the Army calls it training with industry. So essentially you take somebody who works maybe in a logistics field and they go work with a shipping company or something like that. Somebody who works in communications goes over and works with one of the IT companies. That exists right now. So my recommendation for the direct commissioning of bringing that expertise from the outside into the Army unit, rather than taking the Army officer, which is important to take the Army officer and go stick him in Dell or Sun or Google, is to take somebody from one of those IT, put them into an active staff. And some of the discussions that we had in DC was, does that individual actually need to be wearing a uniform? And from our view, the answer is yes. For those of us that have deployed, sometimes you show up and you have different advisors, you have all these different folks. At the end of the day, the uniform makes a difference. The rank on the shoulder makes a difference, especially when you're talking about influence in a staff. So the direction that I went on this was to recommend that if you're going to take, essentially somebody from the private sector that's got a significant amount of education and experience there and embed them into a staff, they need to be, wearing a uniform and have some authority. But essentially the point that you said of kind of switching Army officer going to work in private sector and somebody from the private sector going to work into the Army is exactly what we're advocating for in this.
Professor Pope.
Yeah, I had a.
And if you could identify yourself too.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm Paul Pope, and I was an Army officer, and I got detailed to the CIA, and I ended up finishing my career over there, retiring from the Army in the reserves, and now I'm retired from the CIA. And there was a lot of things I was thinking as you guys were talking in terms of cross-leveling, like, just look at the side here, my friend who took a shot at me a minute ago, so I think.
That's right. But, your time's up, Paul. Another question.
The reason that we don't have the mid-career professional training that the military has is because the answer was in your first question, because Congress won't let us, because it's a very expensive thing. It has to be funded, underwritten. It means you have a larger training base of people, extra slots so you can train people. And they won't support that for us, and they damn sure won't support it for a state or somebody else. But I was standing one time with Senator Coates, and he was marveling at the use of technology that we were doing, and he asked me flat out, he said, who's now the DNI, by the way, why can you guys do this in the military camp? I said, well, sir, I was in the military, and CIA doesn't drag these acquisition rules that they drag with them. But it does make me wonder about not just exchanging hostages, but actually, like, you develop it. We go to your war colleges. I think there are areas of cooperation that aren't just like drawing lessons from one another and cross-leveling that's important, work that having officers know one another and that kind of thing. But there are actually capabilities that other organizations can do. And I just wonder what you thought about that. Because y'all mentioned interagency a couple of times in your thing there. So my question is, what can we do with each other that makes it faster, better, a little bit?
Well, I think exposure, I can speak on the Army side, that I think exposure at a younger age, whether it's officers or rising senior NCOs, just understanding that. When I was a platoon leader, I don't think interagency, I don't think I ever heard the term.
Let's see.
Exactly. And maybe that wasn't the time, but what I came to, and I think we've all come to understand, is there are capabilities that we cannot, will not have, or won't have to the depth or the responsive flexibility that it needs to be. That's one thing we talked about earlier today is I think we get a good broad understanding of many areas, but what's great about coming here and having some of the discussions today and yesterday, we may not have the depth in a region. We may not have, in the Intel community, they've been looking at, somebody may have been looking at a problem for their entire career that we may just have come in for the last 6 to 12 months.
So we have a station in that country.
Absolutely. So it's understanding, okay, how do we work better together? What am I bringing to the table, and what expertise do you have in place? I think the biggest thing is having earlier introductions and exposure, and going back, the hard part is, when are we going to do it? No one has any white space on the calendar to say, hey, why don't you go to X country just for 2 years and go immerse yourself in, good language training and.
Good company command.
Exactly. So I think that it's always going to be at the cost of, we've got to make a decision, and, okay, do we kind of put a hold of this area here for this one person because this is important? And I know we've seen in the last 10 years, we have seen I think some good cases of that. We've got, increased emphasis on language training. As Americans, we don't travel across the ocean every year. I mean, that's not what we do, and we struggle in language capability as a nation, and I think that's one area that, hey, that's something that we probably need to get better at being able to, we need to be able to communicate within our own government and partnerships, and need to do it internationally. But I think getting exposed to it early on may be the first step.
Time for one more question there in the back.
No, thank you.
All right,
I'd like to thank the gentleman for getting off the res and going out in the civilian world. It needs to happen more often, and I'm pleased to see you here. So I have to take the sharpest exception possible with Mr. Inboden's introductory remarks about how great the United States military is and its capabilities, because we've been at war for something over 16 years, and we have failed against third-string opponents in all our wars. And that should, that leads to the elephant in the room question as to why are we failing in our wars, and is that question being discussed seriously at Carlisle? That is the fundamental question about the United States military, I think, and I'd like to know if it's being addressed and if any of you have any thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'd be happy to talk about that, and that is something that we discuss at a strategic level. What are the challenges that keep us from being more successful? What is it that is dragging these out? The director of our program likes to bring up the example of during the negotiations for the peace treaty in Vietnam, one of our generals is alleged to have said, "You never beat us in a tactical fight," and his Vietnamese counterpart responded, "True but irrelevant." So we can be.
That story's been shown by scholarly research.
Okay, perhaps not true, but the point is that maybe tactically we are without peer. That doesn't mean that the strategic choices that we make are going to result in the outcome, the political outcome that we want. And that is the focus of the War College. It is really, do our ends, ways, and means, are they aligned to bring about the political objectives that we want? Do we always get it right? Clearly not. Is that something that we are working on to try and improve on? Yes. So we spent the last year looking at that, trying to figure out where we can do better. And I know there's a lot of hunger out there to try and improve on that.
Let me, and this is our, we're going to have to wrap up here because we're out of time, but let me add a final coda from the civilian perspective here, which these gentlemen I think are too honorable to say as the only civilian on the panel. I blame a lot of our failures in those wars on our civilian leadership. I think the military has by and large done everything we've asked of them. Yeah, there's a few areas that we'd all agree the military could have done better, but I think there were failures of strategy, failures of political courage, and failures to listen to best military advice in a number of key junctures in those conflicts. And so as someone who has a historian as well as a recovering policymaker myself looks at these things, I think when the histories of these conflicts are written, the civilian leadership is going to bear more of the blame for the less than ideal outcomes. So anyway, with that self-flagellation from the civilian up here, please join me in thanking these guys.